Okay, Sarah, well today we're going to talk about questionnaires as a data collection method. And I guess the first question is, why would you use a questionnaire?
Yeah, that's a good question, because actually most people will go straight off when they think about data collection and they'll think, well, I use a questionnaire because it's really easy. And a lot of people will just go straight into designing a questionnaire, putting it together, getting some questions in, and actually that doesn't make a great questionnaire. There are a lot of inherent problems and issues with questionnaires, and they really need to be thought through before you embark on creating a questionnaire.
Right, so what kind of issues, what kind of challenges face a researcher if you're going to use questionnaires?
Well, I suppose the first thing is around the quality of data that you get back from a questionnaire. It's very hard when you send a questionnaire out to somebody to ensure that you get accuracy of information back, and you also get complete answers to the questions that you send. And then there'll also be something about the response rate. You can't always guarantee that everybody is going to send the questionnaire back to you. So there's issues around how you get people to actually respond to those questionnaires. There's also the problem of motivating respondents, and I suppose that's related to the low response rate. So how do you actually get respondents to actually return the questionnaires, and how well are they motivated in order to do that? And of course, if you're not there yourself, you can also find that if you're not there to help people, that they can be quite brief in the way that they answer the questions. You might not always get the depth that you want. Even if you are asking relatively simple questions, people can just sometimes give one-word answers. I think another issue is around misunderstanding answers that you might get. If answers are ambiguous, you can't always check for understanding. And one of the reasons you can't check for understanding is because you can't ask further questions. The other thing is that the wording of the actual questions can have a major effect on the way that people will answer the questions. And that's partly related to respondents' literacy levels, and we can't assume that everybody has the same literacy levels when they come to answer the questionnaire. So we need to think very carefully about the language we use when we're actually designing the questions.
Of course, that's where an interview has the advantage that if there's an issue about misunderstanding, the interviewer can intervene and clarify that.
Absolutely, and that's not possible obviously with questionnaires.
No.
So it's related to some of those earlier points that we were talking about clarifying misunderstandings. And obviously in association with that, people speak much more easily than they tend to write. So yeah, there's all the issues surrounding that. The other thing is around people's honesty. So we assume that when people give us an answer, they're being honest, and they might be being honest, but they might also be tailoring the answer to what it is we think we want to hear. And actually that's probably true of all of the data collection tools, but it's harder to see through that in a questionnaire because you don't have that personal contact with somebody. And again, this is probably also related to the other data collection tools, but also it's much harder to manage in questionnaires is the respondent's understanding of what's going to happen to that data, where that data will go. You're not there in order for them to qualify that, even if you've done some informed consent with the respondents beforehand. It's still hard when they're not with you as the questions are being answered for them to clarify that with you. And I guess that's related to the whole subject of ethics and research rigour, which we'll talk about at a different time.
So there's an awful lot of challenges to consider when you're thinking about using questionnaires. What you're saying is they're not straightforward and they need to be really carefully thought through before you make that decision.
Indeed, there's a lot of things to work through before you decide on using a questionnaire.
Using questionnaires can be quite problematic. There are some challenges and some issues. In which case, why, as a researcher, would you actually use a questionnaire?
Yeah, good question, because all we've done is talk about the problems. But actually, the reason that most people choose questionnaires, whether this is the right or wrong reason, is because they're very low cost in terms of money. It's a way of getting a large amount of information from a wide number of people fairly quickly, particularly if you set a short deadline for it. So that's one of the reasons that most people will go for questionnaires, because it's low cost in terms of money and you can access a wide variety of people very quickly. I think there's also something around the fact that respondents themselves can access the questionnaire and fill the questionnaire in at a time that suits them. We're here now and we've had to arrange a time to meet in order to do this. But actually, if you send out questionnaires to a wide variety of people, they can decide when they want to fill it in and send it back. So that's another reason.
And I guess that also links to the accessibility of a survey or a questionnaire with the advent of digital tools.
Indeed.
Because you can get it to so many people so easily.
Yes, because of course, questionnaires you don't have to send out. You can actually, digitally, you can actually have paper copies of questionnaires. But yeah, I think for all sorts of reasons, I think one ought to think about using questionnaires digitally, not least because it's easy to access for many people, but when it comes to the analysis, it's also more straightforward, particularly if you're using numerical data. And actually that comes on to another benefit really of using questionnaires, is that analysing the data can actually be more straightforward, particularly when you are using numerical data within the questionnaire. I think another strength of questionnaires is anonymity. So obviously I know it's you sitting here because we're together in the same room and it's very hard to make this anonymous, but with questionnaires you don't have to collect information on who that actual person is. You might know who you wanted to send the questionnaire to, but you're not sure who it is who sent it back in the whole number that went out. So for some people they quite like the fact that there's that anonymity. Related to that probably is also this notion of bias, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about ethics, but there are some inherent biases when we're sitting here together. Even if I'm not leading you down a particular road in terms of your answer, just my body language might send you down a particular way of answering a question. With questionnaires that are sent out and they're online, that bias is not there from the person who's asking the question. They're not so obvious. So those really are probably the main benefits of questionnaires.
So as with any research method, there's a balance to be struck between the advantages or the strengths and the disadvantages or the challenges.
Yeah, I would say that's fairly true, yeah.
Okay then, Sarah, from what I'm hearing, using questionnaires is problematic. It can have some advantages, but it also faces challenges. There are problems as well. So what are the practicalities in terms of using questionnaires?
I think when you're starting to think about questionnaires, there are three things that you really need to consider. So first of all, questions can fall into categories. There's different kinds of categories of questions. That's the first thing you need to think about. The second thing is that there are different types of question, and those questions, those different types fall into the different categories. The next thing, or the last thing you should really start thinking about is how those questions appear to people when they look at them on the questionnaire. And we would call that formatting. So there's something around the format of those questions. So if we look at the first thing, which is the categories of questions, broadly speaking, questions will fall into one of three different categories. The first category of question are factual questions, so questions of fact. So it might be, are you a male or a female? Do you fall into the age group 10 to 19 or 20 to 30? So they're trying to get some factual information from you. The second kind of question are around opinions, beliefs or judgments, and these are actually quite hard to ask, and they're also fairly difficult to answer, and that's because beliefs are often quite complex. The beliefs that people hold when they actually delve deeper behind some of the questions you might ask, they might not have really formed or understand their own belief systems which inform those answers. So actually they're quite hard questions to phrase and very difficult for some people to answer. And then the third kind of question is around behaviour, and these are fairly straightforward to ask, but they're fairly difficult to interpret, and that's because when people give you an answer around the behaviour, you often feel there's something missing and you want to probe a little bit deeper, but of course the person's not in front of you anymore, so you're unable to do that. So those are the three categories of questions that we'd be looking at. Then you have different types of questions that will fall within those categories. So the first question is the first type of question is what we'd call a closed question, and closed questions are predetermined. For example, as we've already talked about, how would you describe your gender? How would you what type of nationality do you have? So that they're sort of one-word answers, or they're actually available in predetermined boxes that you already have. You give people the option to select something. And the second type, obviously, is the opposite to closed, which are open questions, where you're giving people space to actually answer something in a series of lines that you've left blank for them. And so the third area we were going to talk about was formatting, and how do you format your questionnaire, and what do you need to think about in terms of format. So the sorts of things that are covered in this are, if you're going to give people something to answer in a closed question, are you going to make a little box, or is it going to be a circle? Are you going to ask them to put a cross in it, or do you want them to give a tick? Do you want them to underline words, or do you want them to circle words if you're getting them to select a word that describes their feeling or their behaviour? Are you going to use letters or numbers to ask your questions? Are you going to have routing questions? So routing questions would be something like, if you answered yes to question 3, please now go to question 7. If you answered no, please go to question 11. So these are routing questions. So there's quite a lot of things to think about in terms of the formatting. So yeah, those are the three things I'd consider: the category of question, the type of question that would go within that category, and also the formatting. I suppose the one thing to point out is there is a golden rule in terms of questionnaires, and that is consistency. So whatever you're doing, be consistent throughout. Don't ask somebody to tick a box in question 3 and then ask them to fill in a circle in question 5 or put a cross later on. You need to be consistent all the way through.
So we've talked there about how we actually format, the types of questions that you could use. Are there any particular questions then that we need to think about in terms of design, and particularly, I guess, in terms of administering a questionnaire?
Yeah, I think there's probably two things that you really need to consider. The first thing is how does it look? So visually, is it an attractive looking questionnaire? It might sound a silly question, but we've already mentioned in the problems that actually response rate can be quite difficult, and actually motivating people to respond can be hard. So the more attractive you can make the questionnaire, the better. So that, and also the consideration is for those who are visually impaired. You need to make sure you've thought about that as well. So you really should give some thought to basically how it looks. Does it have a nice, attractive look about it? And then the second thing, and it might sound obvious, is does it work? So you need to be thinking about, for example, if you've used routing questions, actually, do they make sense? When you go, if question 3 says go to question 5, when you go to question 5, have you asked the relevant question there? Quite often, when you're producing a questionnaire, you will change the questions, or you might change the order. And if you've already got the routing question in there and you forget to change the routing question to the new question, then actually it doesn't really work. And there's nothing worse than sending out a questionnaire that doesn't work and getting replies back saying, did you really mean that there, from one of your respondents? This comes back to something we might talk about later, which is around piloting. It's always a really good idea to pilot a questionnaire, because with the best will in the world, and we've all done it, sometimes things slip through that you just don't see, and it's worth getting a few people just to see, does it look great, does it do what it says it's going to do, does it actually work, do all the routing questions work, for example. There's probably something else you probably need to think about in terms of the design. We've talked quite a lot about the questions that go in it, but when you've finally created this and you're happy with it, you need to do something called topping and tailing. And that means you need to give some form of introduction rather than just go straight into the questionnaire. And this is separate to getting informed consent from the participants, the respondents. But it's something about introducing what the questionnaire is about, why you're collecting the information. We would call this topping it, so introducing it. And also you need to tail it. So really, people have been giving their time most often freely. You need to give a thank you message, probably leave your contact details in case there's any problems, and just a reminder of what you're going to be doing with the data. Something that's short and brief, but a sort of an ending to that questionnaire. So topping and tailing needs a little bit of thought as well. And we've talked about administrating the questionnaire, and we've almost took it for granted that it would be an online questionnaire, but there are many different ways of doing a questionnaire. So you might actually have a captive audience in front of you. So if you're a school teacher, for example, you might want to questionnaire your students, and they might be sat in front of you, and you might say, okay, you've got the next half an hour to fill in this questionnaire, and we would call that a captive audience. We've talked about emailing out a questionnaire, but you might personally want to deliver a questionnaire. You might want to personally deliver it as an online version with a link, but you actually might want a paper copy, particularly if you're using a cohort of people who are not very savvy with technology. So you need to think about whether you're posting it, whether you're doing it online, and also give people a deadline. People like to know when something has to be completed by. It's also probably going to help you in terms of your response rate if you think about sending a gentle or a polite reminder to people who haven't actually already completed it. Obviously you might not know who's completed it, it might have to be a blanket email that goes out to everybody, but just a reminder as you're approaching the deadline, maybe a week or 10 days prior to it. Maybe starting off with a thank you message to those who've already completed it, but if you haven't had time, we'd really appreciate your answers. They're going to so contribute to whatever it is you're doing and be really helpful in such and such, and we thank you for your time. That sort of message, and you've only got 10 days left to do this. That sort of message, I would recommend sending that out about 10 days prior to the deadline.
Okay then, Sarah, so we've covered an awful lot there. We've covered a lot of ground about questionnaires, about their design, about their implementation. Is there anything else you want to add?
I suppose there are a couple of general points, and this would be true for most probably data collection tools. The first one is around bias. I think you need to be very careful not to ask leading questions. Often when you're creating a questionnaire, you'll have an idea of the sorts of answers that you're expecting, and that can actually lead you to phrase the question in a certain way and lead respondents into the answer you want to get. And I think you need to be really mindful of what that bias is that you have and what those expected answers are, and make sure that you try and be as neutral as possible in the way that you answer the questions. Another thing is probably necessity. Questionnaires very easily become very, very long, and I think you need to be careful that you're only actually asking questions that you really need an answer for. And when I say need an answer for, I think the golden rule is ask yourself when you've written a question, how are you going to use that question in your data analysis? How is that going to inform your research question? Will it actually give you some information that you can use, and how will you use it? And if you can't really answer that, then maybe you shouldn't be asking that question.
I think that's a really good point, because I often see questionnaires that, for example, have a lot of what you call factual questions.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're referred to as demographic questions, where you want to find out, for example, the sex of a person, the age, and so on. But if you're never going to analyse the data by that, so for example, you're never going to find out, was there any difference between how males responded to these questions compared to females, then it's a waste of time asking that question in the first place.
Indeed,
So I think it's really important, particularly in those demographic questions, to think, am I going to analyse my data through this particular question? And of course that leads us into the whole issue about analysis as well of data.
Yeah. And probably tied into that is one last point I'll make, which is about simplicity. It's very easy in questionnaires to become complicated. And the more complicated you are in your question, the less likely it is you're going to get the kind of answers which you're able to analyse. So try wherever possible to keep the questions simple and clean and to the point and neutral if you at all can. And we've talked about piloting it. I think those are really the only other things I'd add.
Oh, that's great. Very comprehensive. Thank you.